The year is 1805, and Napoleon plans to invade Britain. The only thing standing in his way is the Royal Navy, the wooden wall protecting the British Isles. Napoleon knew that France could not win in a direct fight, so he planned to outmaneuver the British and quickly land his invasion force. The British, and Nelson in particular, wanted a decisive engagement, and they would soon have it. Towards the end of 1801, Europe grew tired of war. Negotiations took place, and on the 27th of March the next year, the Peace of Amiens was signed, ending the Second Coalition. The peace set out various terms that needed to be upheld. Neither the French nor the British stuck to theirs, and combined with a general desire for conflict, the War of the Third Coalition broke out in May of 1803. By 1805, Austria, Russia, and Spain also joined the war. Like many French leaders before him, Napoleon had plans to invade Britain. He assembled the Armée d'Angleterre in northern France, with the intent of invading Britain with it. His main obstacle was the English Channel. The Royal Navy was the most powerful one in Europe, and patrolled the English Channel in order to prevent an invasion. The French and Spanish combined would not be able to defeat the British, so Napoleon had to find another way to clear the English Channel. He came up with what he thought was a brilliant plan. The Royal Navy had blockaded the majority of the Spanish and French navies. Admiral Villeneuve was to break out of the blockade imposed by Nelson at Toulon. He was then to join up with the Spanish squadron at Cartagena and sail to Cadiz to relieve the blockade there. With the ships in Cadiz, he was to sail to the Caribbean to draw the British fleet there. Admiral Guantam and 21 ships of the line were blockaded in at Brest. They were to try and escape and join up with Villeneuve in the Caribbean, but if not, he would break the blockade for them. Another large Spanish squadron was blockaded in at Ferrol, and Villeneuve also had to free them on his return to Europe. Once the majority of the British Navy were on a wild goose chase in the Caribbean, Villeneuve and possibly Guantam were to sail back to Europe, break the blockade at Ferrol, and enter the Channel with around 60 ships of the line. They would then defeat the Channel patrols, and Napoleon could begin landing his troops, all before Nelson and the rest of the Royal Navy could return. Initially, everything went as intended for the French. Villeneuve escaped Nelson's loose blockade on the 31st of March. They were undetected, so Nelson had no idea where they were headed. He decided to wait in the Mediterranean until he had more information. The French reached Cartagena, but the Spanish squadron there was not ready to sail. Villeneuve left immediately as he was afraid of Nelson. The fleet reached Cadiz on the 9th of April and drove away the blockade there. They joined up with Gravina's squadron, and the fleet set sail for Martinique in the Caribbean. Admiral Guantam wanted to escape with his fleet, but Napoleon ordered him to stay put. Within a few weeks, Cornwallis received powerful reinforcements from England, and the window of opportunity for the French had closed. Much credit needs to be given to Admiral Cornwallis. Throughout the entire Trafalgar campaign, he kept a large portion of the French navy locked up in Brest, and this made the invasion nearly impossible. Nelson received word that the French sailed through the Straits of Gibraltar and set sail for that himself. He correctly assumed, given the information available to him, that Villeneuve was sailing to the Caribbean and pursued him there. Villeneuve reached Martinique on the 14th of May and waited for Admiral Guantam. He never arrived, as he was still blockaded in Brest, so when Villeneuve heard that Nelson also arrived in the Caribbean, he hastily set sail and left. Nelson heard reports of French movement and followed them back to Europe. Nelson returned to Gibraltar quickly, aided by very favourable winds. Villeneuve reached Ferrol a few days later and fought the indecisive Battle of Cape Feneste with Calder's squadron. Although 2 of his ships were captured, he managed to free the Spanish fleet in Ferrol, and the 2 fleets joined up and sailed to Cadiz. Knowing that the threat of invasion was now very real, both Nelson and Calder moved to the English Channel. This is where Napoleon's plan ultimately failed. He simply assumed that the British would be foolish enough to leave the Channel weakly guarded, when in reality nearly the entire Royal Navy was now present. Napoleon ultimately abandoned his plans for an invasion and moved his army into Germany. In the meantime, Nelson had returned to England, where he stayed for 4 weeks. Admiral Collingwood's flying squadron arrived at Cadiz and was soon bolstered by Calder's squadron of 18 ships. Nelson left England on the 14th of September and reached the fleet 2 weeks later. Admiral Calder was recalled to England. By mid-October, the British fleet blockading Cadiz was up to full strength. Nelson had at his command 27 ships of the line and 4 frigates. Many of the captains present were close friends of Nelson, and he described the 3 weeks before the battle as the happiest in his life. Nelson kept a loose blockade of Cadiz, as he wanted the Allied fleet to leave the port so that he could fight the battle. By doing this, he also concealed his true strength and kept his enemy in the dark. Nelson regularly met with his captains to discuss his plan. He wanted to attack the Allied fleet in 2 columns and split their line in 3. The British ships would then overwhelm and defeat the rear and the centre before the vanguard could come to their aid. Upon hearing the plan, many of Nelson's captains wept from joy. The British spent the blockade preparing for a battle and refining their gunnery. Nelson knew that his crews were superior to the French and Spanish crews, so in a one-on-one, the British ship would always prevail. The blockade soon paid off. On the 18th of October, Villeneuve received a letter from Napoleon saying that he was about to be replaced as admiral, and that his replacement was already in Madrid. Wanting to avoid disgrace, he ordered his fleet to set sail for the Straits of Gibraltar. Due to calm winds and bad coordination, it took a whole day and a half for the fleet to leave port. The British fleet was 80 kilometers to the west when the frigates reported movement. The fleet set sail at once and prepared for battle. They moved to the Straits of Gibraltar to cut off the French. They spent most of the 20th in the strait, waiting for the French. When they did not arrive, Nelson set out to find them. During the night, British frigates spotted the French fleet in between the British one and Spain, heading south. Nelson ordered his fleet to pursue. The wind favoured the British, and they quickly caught up to the Allied fleet. On the morning of the 21st, the 2 battle fleets saw each other. Villeneuve ordered the Allied fleet to return to Cadiz, but it was too late. The battle that the British eagerly desired for years was now inevitable. Like a pot of orcas, the Royal Navy was closing in for the kill. Throughout the morning, the British closed in on the Allied fleet so that at 11:45 they were about a kilometre away. A quick note on the wind. You will see in the bottom left that there is a compass and a wind speed indicator. The red pointer on the compass points in the direction of the wind. The camera itself will always point towards the north, so that can be used for reference. I could not find exact measurements for wind speed, so the indicator shows relative wind speed. The British attack consisted of 2 columns. Nelson on HMS Victory was at the head of the column aimed at the centre of the Allied fleet. This column consisted of 12 ships of the line, but had 3 of the largest British ships at the front. The second column was led by Admiral Collingwood, in whom Nelson had a very capable second-in-command. Collingwood's flagship was HMS Royal Sovereign and was also at the front of the line. His column was aimed at the Allied rear and consisted of 16 ships of the line. Further north, in a peculiar spot, we find HMS Africa. During the night, she missed a turn and ended up a few kilometers north at daybreak. She was able to get to the battle in time though. At 11:45, the Allied line was in the shape of a crescent. In the front, there was the vanguard, led by Admiral Dumanoir on his flagship Formidable. The vanguard consisted of 10 ships of the line. Moving south, we find the centre, led by the massive Spanish ship Santísima Trinidad, with 136 cannons. Directly behind it was Admiral Villeneuve on his flagship Bucentaur. The centre consisted of 8 ships of the line. The rear was the strongest, as it consisted of 15 ships of the line that were almost in line formation. It was led by Admiral Gravina on his flagship Príncipe de Asturias. The positions of the ships shown are approximately what they were at 11:45. It was at this time that Nelson sent his famous signal, "England expects that every man will do his duty." It is important to note that England was used to refer to the whole of the UK, so the Scottish, Irish and Welsh were not excluded. About 5 minutes after the signal was sent, French and Spanish ships opened fire on HMS Victory. She was under fire from over 100 cannons at some stage. The wind became weaker and Nelson's column slowly moved towards the French line. To the south, Collingwood was doing the same. At 12 o'clock, HMS Royal Sovereign was fired upon. Unlike HMS Victory though, she managed to close the gap quickly as the winds here were faster and had not yet become weaker. Normally in battle, a cannon was loaded with 1 charge and 1 shot, giving it good range and accuracy. At Trafalgar though, the British double-shotted their cannons, reducing the range and accuracy but increasing the damage. The British knew that they would fight in close quarters, so neither range nor accuracy really mattered. Royal Sovereign crossed the Allied line at 10 minutes past 12. She fired double-shotted broadsides into Santa Ana and Fugu. She turned a bit and dealt with Santa Ana and the other ships nearby. 3 minutes later, HMS Belleisle also crossed and fired broadsides. She came into contact with Fugu and fought multiple ships at the same time. HMS Mars was third to cross and engaged Pluton. HMS Tonnant followed and fought Monaco and Algeciras. By 12:30, another 4 British ships joined the fight, including HMS Bellerophon, who engaged Aguil and Monaco. More British ships were on the way. For the last 40 minutes, HMS Victory had been heavily battered as she slowly got closer to the Allied line, and weak winds did not help. At some stage she was travelling at a speed of 1 knot. At 12:30, she finally entered the gap between Bucentaur and Redoutable. Where most British ships had double-shotted cannons, HMS Victory took this one step further. Her cannons were treble-shotted, nearly packed full with iron and gunpowder. HMS Victory fired a broadside into the stern of the Bucentaur, and the effect was absolutely devastating. 200 of her 700-man crew were killed instantly, as 150 cannonballs raced down the length of the ship, effectively knocking the French flagship out of action. HMS Victory also fired a broadside into the Redoutable, with whom she got entangled. The Redoutable was the most prepared ship in the Allied fleet. Her captain, Jean Lucas, knew that they could not outgun the British and so opted to board their ships instead. He had sharpshooters in the rigging of his ship to shoot at the British crew and assembled a large boarding party on his deck. HMS Temeraire followed Victory through the gap and poured a broadside into the Bucentaur, further damaging it. She fired another broadside into the Redoutable, killing 200 members of the boarding party and ending its hopes of boarding the Victory. She then entangled with the Redoutable, and after a while the French ship was sandwiched between 2 British 3-deckers. HMS Neptune sailed in between the Bucentaur and the Santissima Trinidad and fired on both. By now, more British ships were joining Nelson, but their progress was slow thanks to the wind. Most ships in the Allied line were barely moving at all. At 25 minutes past 1, the battle took its most famous casualty. Admiral Nelson had stood on the deck of his flagship since the beginning of the battle, decorated with many medals. A French sharpshooter saw the admiral and shot him. Nelson immediately knew that he was going to die and was carried below deck by the crew. At 1:30, Villeneuve signaled for Dumanoir to turn around and join the battle. The wind would make this very difficult, and Dumanoir would only be able to counterattack later in the afternoon. 15 minutes after sending the signal, the Bucentaur surrendered to HMS Conqueror, becoming the first Allied ship to strike her colours. Moving south again, more British ships were entering the fight. HMS Colossus took on Swiftsure and Bahama, outgunning both at the same time. The French ship Fugu had continued on her course and was now heading towards HMS Temeraire. The front half of the Allied rear was suffering badly as a result of British gunnery. By 1:30, the entire rear was engaged, as the majority of Collingwood's column had entered the battle. Admiral Gravina's flagship came under fire from Defiance and Dreadnought. HMS Dreadnought also fired on San Juan, and as a result of the heavy fire she received from the 3-decker, she surrendered just before 2. Algeciras and Monaco also surrendered shortly afterwards. We now follow Fugu, whose captain, at about 2 o'clock, made the terrible mistake of attempting to board HMS Temeraire. When she pulled up alongside the British ship, she received a devastating full broadside, which combined with damage she sustained so far forced her to strike her colours at about 2:10. In order to respond to Dumanoir's incoming attack, Captain Hardy ordered that HMS Victory move away from Redoutable, who also surrendered at 2:20. With nearly 500 of her 600 crew killed, she suffered the highest casualties of any ship at the battle. To the north, HMS Africa had gone down the line and fired at many Allied ships in turn. She was now firing at the Santissima Trinidad, along with Neptune and Conqueror. Caught in a devastating crossfire, the Santissima Trinidad stopped firing around 2:10. Her captain only formally surrendered the ship an hour and a half later, but as of now she was effectively out of action. The British ships involved here then moved to help hold off Dumanoir's attack, so that more ships would come to support. By 3 o'clock, the battle in the rear was almost over. Some Allied ships had escaped, and the majority of those left shortly surrendered. By 3:30, Gravina's flagship was still in action with a fighting retreat. Some British ships were engaged with her, but seeing as she was retreating, these ships moved to the north to help repel Dumanoir. When the son Ildefonso surrendered, only the Aquil remained fighting. When Dumanoir's attack finally materialized, it fell short of its intended impact. He attacked in 2 columns with a total of 9 ships, 5 of which attacked HMS Victory and the ships around her, and the other 4 moving to the south to assist Gravina. The Intrepide approached the Bucentaur, but she was soon cut off and overwhelmed by 3 British ships, who forced her to surrender. Victory, Temeraire and Royal Sovereign engaged Dumanoir directly. More fresh ships arrived to protect the damaged ones, and seeing that yet more reinforcements were on their way, Dumanoir called off his attack. In the other column, the Neptuno and the San Agustin were cut off by British ships and forced to surrender shortly after 5. The action in the north was now completely over, as the Santissima Trinidad had also surrendered. Horatio Nelson passed away at 4:30 when the battle was effectively over. Before dying, he was told that Britain had won a decisive victory and that the battle was in its last stages. His last words were, "Thank God, I have done my duty." With the counterattack repelled, the fighting was over. The French ship Aquil had been set on fire as a result of the fighting. Her crew abandoned ship and were rescued by the British. At 5:30 she exploded, and this marked the end of the battle. The battle was a decisive British victory, the only major negative being the loss of Nelson. He died alongside 448 comrades, and a further 1,200 had been wounded. Given the scale of the battle, British casualties were light. That was not the case for the Allies, who lost 10 times as many men at about 4,500. A further 2,400 were wounded, and the British took 7,000 prisoners. The Allies also lost 18 ships, which at the time was over a quarter of the total combined navies of France and Spain. The British lost none. Directly after the battle, a powerful storm hit the British fleet. Vice Admiral Collingwood, who now took control of the fleet, said that the week after the battle was the worst of his life, as everyone struggled to stay afloat. Some captured ships sank, and some enemy crews retook their vessels and escaped. Miraculously, no British ship was lost. After the battle, most ships escaped to Cadiz, but Dumanoir went south with his squadron of 4 ships. He was eventually caught by another British squadron, and all 4 ships were captured. This solidified the victory at Trafalgar. Nelson's body was taken back to England, where he received a state funeral. He lost his eye, his arm, and ultimately his life for his country. The Battle of Trafalgar had an enormous impact in both the short and the long term. It immediately ended any invasion threat, as Britannia now truly ruled the waves. In the long term, it laid the foundation for Britain's imperial ambitions. The victory at Trafalgar, along with a strong economic base and industrialization, allowed Britain's navy to retain control of the oceans, and this in turn led to the world's largest empire. It would take 140 years for Britain to be supplanted as the world's leading naval power. Horatio Nelson is certainly one of the greatest admirals of all time. If you have watched to the end, thank you very much. You are an excellent subscriber. This concludes the series on Horatio Nelson, and next we will be moving on to ancient Egypt.